My name is Toby Ziegler and I'm an artist, and I'm doing this workshop for Hospital Room's Digital Art School, focusing mainly on collage. You will need a set of Toby Ziegler printouts, some coloured paper, old magazines, tracing paper, acrylic paint, brushes, a glue stick, a ruler and a pot of water. I wanted to tell you a story to try and introduce my work. I went to art school, and when I left I felt totally disillusioned. I bought a computer and I learnt how to do 3D modelling, and I started by making this model of my dad's breakfast. And he was a very habitual man who had breakfast exactly the same way every day of his life, with a hard-boiled egg, half a grapefruit, a piece of toast and a cup of coffee. And this little setup was like this sort of monument in our house. It was always there on the table. And I found this totally horrific when I was a kid. I was like, I never want to be like that. And then as I got older, I started to think actually this was like the kind of ritual that made his whole day work. It was like this touchstone. It was the only part of his day that was totally regular, and after that he'd go off and use his imagination and be much freer. But I thought it would be interesting to try and just model this form and represent it in the most sort of rudimentary ways. And then what I gradually found was that I was able to kind of loosen up and retaliate against this really orderly way of working. And I had this kind of structure, and then I had some sort of freedom within that structure. And I suppose that's kind of central, actually, to the project that we're going to do in the workshop. I've made a set of sheets of paper printed with patterns. I use patterns heavily in my work. I guess I use them a lot of the time as a kind of structure. It's like a kind of order in the work, but it's also something against which you can retaliate. You can kind of find a freedom. And sometimes I use them to describe forms, but also the thing that's interesting about them is that they're completely non-figurative as well. So although something like that looks like a terrain disappearing towards a vanishing point, but at the end of the day it is still just pure geometry, it's just pattern. And I just had a couple of examples of things, like I was interested in the way that in Japanese prints often patterns are used as these kind of flat layers, but they describe a recession. During the Renaissance, people started to use patterns to describe volumes and spaces in a different way, a kind of perspectival way. Like this is a uccello, and there's this funny kind of grid on the floor made out of these spears that describes this recession. So I've got these pieces of paper. There's various different scales of pattern and different colours, and you can use them in lots of different ways, but the important thing is not to feel too precious about them. I actually found that these big sheets are a little bit unwieldy, so it's quite useful to just fold them in half and then fold it back on itself. And then you can rip them down, and that's a bit easier to work with. So these sheets of paper with various scales and colours of patterns will be in your box if you've received one. But if you haven't, there's also files you can download and you can print them yourself. And I think a good way to start, just to kind of sabotage the sovereignty of the piece of paper, is to just fold it in half and rip a hole so that you end up with a piece of paper with a window in it. I suppose a lot of this workshop, and actually a lot of my practice, centers on the idea of control and then chance. That there are things about making art that are concerned with the idea of trying to make the materials do certain things. But then another big part, for me, of making art is the idea that the stuff you can't control and the stuff that you have to let go of. And actually, often chance creates better results than things you could have done intentionally. For instance, when you rip a piece of paper, you can never be sure quite where it's going to go. But there's pleasure in it. And there's something beautiful about the way the paper behaves. And I love this torn edge that you get. Sometimes it's good to just slow down and let the materials do what they do best and just enjoy that process. And then you have these two elements. You've got a sort of foreground and a background, or maybe it's the other way around. And maybe you think it's a landscape, or maybe it's like a sort of vignette, like a frame, and you're looking through. Or maybe that's totally unimportant, and actually you just enjoy the relationship of one thing next to another thing. You can now choose a second element. You might want to lay it on top of a flat colour like this, or you might prefer to stick it on top of another pattern. Like, I think that different patterns kind of vibrate at different frequencies, and interesting things happen when you put them together. Sometimes one wants to kind of float to the front more than the other. So you might want to put it in front of a pattern that's more muted in colour. Or you might want to put it in front of a pattern that's bigger in scale and a bit more layering. You might want to introduce a different language altogether and rip something out of a magazine and throw that into the mix. But to start off with, I think I'm going to treat this like it's a kind of landscape with a hole ripped out of the middle of it. And I'll stick that down. And then maybe I might start putting something else on top. Maybe I can put that back in so it becomes like an island floating. When I've done these workshops in the past, it's been really interesting the way everyone wants to do something totally different with it. Like, some people just really enjoy the kind of formal relationships between one piece of paper and another, or between the ripped edge and the kind of hard edge. Whereas other people create very elaborate stories, and for them it becomes a landscape and a river, and there's some people dancing on the side of the river. So you really can take it in any direction that you like. Like maybe these guys want to invade the space. some people it becomes very autobiographical and they start making pictures that really relate to their memories. Sometimes you don't even know what you're doing as well. Often I find I'm making a picture and it's only like months later I realise that it was totally autobiographical. I'd accidentally revealed some awful secrets about myself. I kind of like that just as it is. They can be very simple, so maybe I'll leave that there. So I've got two pieces that are the same size. And I think I'm just going to rip this one into stripes. I've always been fascinated by patterns because I think we're always looking for pattern in everything, like as a metaphor as much as literally. We're always, as humans, kind of predisposed to find things that connect each other and connect us. We're always looking for like coincidences. And also, I guess, these kind of very hard-edged geometric patterns are quite mathematical, really. But it's nice to introduce softer, more kind of organic lines and allow chance in as well. Somehow for me, the patterns feel like they embody some sort of logic, and it's nice to introduce something that's a bit more intuitive and a bit more random. But really, these are just ideas, very, very rough ideas. I don't think you should feel like you want to necessarily follow any of these approaches. The truth is, I think it's just a set of tools that you can do whatever you want with. I've also got some old postcards. Don't know if that works. But I think it's interesting to introduce different languages. Like maybe we could do a bit of painting on top as well. Something that speaks a really different language and has got much more of the hand in it. So, of course, you might choose to just work with paper and collage, and you can keep collaging as many layers as you want, but another step could be to introduce paint. And I've added lots of water to my paint so that it moves more easily. But there's something quite nice about the way liquids are a bit unruly. They find their own way around. They behave very differently to triangles and straight lines. Like, I think in a way geometry exists as an idea. Like straight lines, they don't exist in nature, do they? And the more you zoom in, the more you realise they're not straight. But they do exist in our imagination, like a perfect circle or a perfect triangle. Maybe I will try using the paint a bit thicker, see how it behaves then. It's more like paste. And we could always go back and introduce more pieces of paper. Maybe I'll make a sort of arch that goes over the top. think that might be done. Knowing when to stop is a key part of making a picture. So on the sheets of paper, there are some which have the same pattern repeated at different sizes. And you might think of this one as a kind of, I mean, you could see it as a landscape with a sky. We could turn it upside down. And in a way, the small patterns recede and the big patterns become foreground. So it could be interesting to think about these layers of pattern as things that are receding from you. Maybe they're clouds. So what I've noticed is if you rip upwards, you end up with this beautiful white line on the bottom layer. So you learn to control it a little, although obviously part of the fun is that it's slightly out of control. So like I was saying, there are these different ways of making, sort of describing a space with patterns, because these flat patterns, the bigger ones seem to come forwards. But then there's this other way of describing space, which is perspectival, where the pattern's all shrinking as they get further away. Okay, last one. So maybe we'll keep the corner there. I think I'm going to do the same thing in this corner. And in fact, maybe I'll just do all the corners. And maybe I will introduce a little bit more colour. So I mean, you can choose to put them however you want, but I'm kind of working from smaller patterns up to bigger patterns. Because for me, the smaller patterns go backwards and recede, and the bigger patterns kind of float to the foreground. And the nice thing about having this approach is that you can try things in different positions. So you can make a shape and then you can see where it belongs. Just move it around till you find somewhere that you're happy with it. Like maybe you sort of want it to dissect some of the other shapes. And maybe they become clouds, or maybe they become trees, or maybe they just stay as one shape in front of another shape. And you might choose to use colours that are really very different from each other, or you might like it when the colours are actually quite close. They're just like one shade of pink next to another shade of pink. And you can always fold things in half, so you can make a hole in the middle of it. And then maybe you decide it's all become a bit too busy, you could just choose to give your eye a rest with a bit of flat colour somewhere. Not sure, but I might introduce a bit of paint at this point. Like, you can use the paint as a kind of wash almost. You can still see the patterns. It's actually quite difficult for me to keep talking and doing this at the same time. I think when I've been painting all day, I forget how to talk. And I go upstairs to try and help make dinner and I'm utterly useless. I think it's a really nice thing about painting is that your brain kind of goes soft and I find I don't think in the same way that I normally do. So then when I go upstairs and my partner's like, "Can you pass the jar of mustard?" I spend about 2 minutes looking in the fridge going, yellow, green, darker, lighter. I think I've just forgotten how to sort of name things. And my brain's just started tuning into colours and tones rather than classifying things. So looking at these, I realised that I've used very little colour. But you can do whatever you want, go to town with it. I think I often do gravitate towards reds and pinks and whites. But it's also interesting, this one feels very simple, but actually I really like just that relationship between the background and the foreground. I'm not sure I needed those guys, now I'm looking at it, but they're there to stay. And this one, they all feel like you're sort of looking through something, through an aperture. I think that's just something, again, that I don't quite know why I do, but it always seems to happen. And everyone, I think, has their own like forms and shapes that they keep gravitating towards. And I remember I had a friend who, when she went to art school, she just kept painting the same thing over and over again, and it was like these 3 yellow shapes in front of a blue background. And then her mum came to see her degree show and went, "Oh yeah, when you were in your pram, I always used to leave you out in the garden, and you had 3 ducks on a piece of string across the top of the pram." So she'd obviously spent months just gazing up at the blue skies with these 3 ducks in front of it, but it just cropped up totally sort of subconsciously as a abstract composition. But it's funny how, yeah, like for me this one feels more like a landscape, but I like the kind of ambiguity about whether it is or not. But I was thinking, if you stick an aeroplane in the sky, then it becomes much more overt. But maybe I prefer the ambiguity, to be honest. But I think that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you very much for joining me on the Digital Art School. We'd love to see your works of art, so please feel free to submit any things you've made to the Hospital Room's website.